During an approach to San Francisco, an Air Canada Airbus A320 came close to crashing into at least one other aircraft on a summer night. Today we are going to take a look at a not very well-known case that could have been one of the deadliest crashes in aviation history. Let's find out what happened. Welcome to Airspace. On July 7, 2017, an Airbus A320 operated by Air Canada had almost completed its flight from Toronto to San Francisco. It was nighttime, about 11 in the evening in San Francisco, when the two pilots saw a need to divert around large thunderstorms. The task was tiresome, especially since it had already been dark outside for almost 2 hours. This made the task of avoiding thunderstorms much more difficult, since the pilots can only rely on their radar displays without any external visual reference. Luckily, they passed the thunderstorms well before it was time for the approach, and they expected good weather in San Francisco. For their approach briefing, the crew considered the weather as well as the ages of the airport, an extended report indicating approach procedures and specialities. As it was nighttime, noise abatement procedures were enforced in San Francisco, and therefore, an approach called the Quiet Bridge visual approach was to be used. This approach takes the aircraft mostly over water and over prominent bridges, the Dumbarton Bridges and the San Mateo Bridge. The approach is flown completely visual, that means there is no beam to follow for this approach. Pilots fly it visually, just like one would in a small aircraft. When Air Canada 759 approached the airport, it too received clearance to follow the Quiet Bridge approach for runway 28 right. San Francisco International Airport is rather complex, featuring 4 runways that are arranged like 2 overlapping crosses. Runway 28 right is the one right here. The two pilots were familiar with the airport, both having flown there several times before that night. The A320 approached the airport nicely and air traffic control cleared the plane to land. However, as the aircraft was less than a minute away from landing, the first officer radioed in and asked air traffic control whether the runway was indeed free for them to land on.
And Tower, just want to confirm this Air Canada 759, we see some lights on the runway there across the runway. Can you confirm the clear to land?
Tower then reassured Air Canada that no other aircraft is on runway 28 right, and they are indeed clear to land.
Air Canada 759 confirms clear to land runway 28 right. There is no one on 28 right, flight you.
But seconds later, as the A320 was just seconds from touchdown, another aircraft that was waiting for departure next to the runway radioed in, agitated, asking where the plane was going, and that it was bearing down on the taxiway.
Where's this guy going? He's on the taxiway.
At this moment, Air Canada 759 had just crossed the seawall leading to the runways. However, in shock, the two pilots now realized that they had made a grave mistake. They had aligned their Airbus not with runway 28 right, but with taxiway Charlie instead. On this taxiway, 2 Boeing 787s, 1 Boeing 737 and the Philippine Airlines Airbus A340 were waiting for departure. Immediately the first officer called for go-around, and at the same moment the captain too had realized what they had gotten themselves into and had already firewalled the throttles and pulled up the nose of the A320. But due to the momentum of the aircraft, it continued to descend for another precious few feet until it finally climbed back into the dark Californian sky. This airport surveillance camera captured the event. Let's review the sequence of events. This is Air Canada 759, and as you can clearly see by the reflection on the ocean surface, back here they are still over water. Here, on taxiway Charlie, 2 United Airlines 787s, a Philippine Airlines A340 and a United Boeing 737 are waiting. Watch how the crew of the Philippine Airlines A340 tried to warn the oncoming A320 by turning on their landing lights at the last second. I can only imagine what went through the heads of those pilots at that moment. Now, the captain of Air Canada 759 finally pulls up and misses the A340 by mere feet. Radio altimeter data taken from the flight data recorder of the Air Canada A320 and measurements taken on the surveillance camera footage suggest that the fuselage of the A320 missed the tail of the A340 by 13.5 feet, or roughly 4 meters and 11 centimeters. Considering the usual descent rate of about 12 feet per second during approach, one can truly appreciate how close this incident came to disaster. Had the pilots waited just about a second longer, a crash would have been unavoidable. The first 787 would have probably been spared, but the momentum would have carried the plane into an A340, a 787 and a 737. Combined, the Air Canada A320 and these 3 planes can seat over 1,200 passengers. This was a very, very close call. The A320 made another uneventful approach to runway 28 right and this time landed on the proper runway surface. After the pilots dutifully reported the incident, an investigation was launched to find out why such a thing could have happened. Some very interesting details and systemic errors pertaining to aviation in general were found and documented. Let's begin by looking at the crew. Both captain and first officer were experienced individuals. Both had been to San Francisco recently. The first officer had even been there just 2 days before the accident. The first officer, aged 42, was described as diligent, and his performance as a first officer was described as above average. He had, however, tried to upgrade to captain twice, but failed due to lapses in situational awareness. After his failures, Air Canada agreed to keep him as a first officer, since he performed that role quite well. He reported to have had enough sleep before the incident. The captain was experienced as well. Aged 56, he had been employed by Canadian Airlines since 1988. He had accumulated about 20,000 hours of flight experience, which amounts to a quite busy career. He had been to San Francisco countless times before. What amazed the investigators was the fact that the captain reported to have had just around 5 hours of sleep before his flight duties, and that he had been awake for more than 19 hours when he attempted to land in San Francisco. He was called as a reserve to fill in for another pilot who had reported in sick for this flight. While these times were legal by Canadian standards, they were out of limits according to the US limits. However, since Air Canada obviously is a Canadian airline, the regulations of that state apply. While this flight was legal with regard to flight duty times, it shines a light on duty time regulations for pilots around the world. As food for thought, the US CDC, the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, states that being awake for 18 hours has the same effect on the body as a blood alcohol level of 0.05 BAC. The list of symptoms at that point include exaggerated behavior, begin of loss of control over small muscles, onset of loss of ability to track objects with your eyes, blurred vision, and the potential to engage in risky behaviors such as drunk driving. So legally, one would not be allowed to drive a car with that blood alcohol content in many countries. And yet, operating an aircraft while under the influence of sleep deprivation with the same symptoms seems to be perfectly fine. I do realize that this does not only apply for aviation, but various other fields as well. I'm especially thinking about doctors pulling 24-hour shifts. Would you like to be operated by a drunk surgeon? I didn't think so. Well, let's get back to the incident flight. There was another interesting element uncovered in the final report. Due to construction works, runway 28 left was closed at night after a certain time. This closure was communicated to pilots by a so-called NOTAM, which is shorthand for Notice to Airmen. The purpose of a NOTAM is, as the name states, to notify pilots of changes to normal operation around airports or airspaces. The idea sounds really great until you have to deal with actual NOTAMs. Let me show you how an actual NOTAM of San Francisco Airport looks like. Looks cryptic, right? And this is only page 1 of 16. Actually, what you are looking at is just a list of cranes erected around the airport. Somewhere in this heap of letters, the information that runway 28 left was closed was buried. The pilots never found that specific info, like the proverbial needle in a haystack. And yet, pilots are supposed to know and consider these NOTAMs. An almost impossible task, if you consider that most airlines only offer around 20 to 30 minutes for a pre-flight briefing. Often, NOTAMs span hundreds of pages and concern all kinds of airports, airspaces, and so on. Some airlines have employees that sift through these NOTAMs to provide some sorting or logic to them so that vital information is not missed. But this is not mandatory, and even for those who do it, it will not always be a reliable measure. The chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board said in a hearing after the incident, "That's what NOTAMs are, they're just a bunch of garbage that no one pays any attention to." Unfortunately, he seems very right. The pilots of Air Canada 759 didn't pay any attention to them either, and missed the fact that runway 28 left was closed. This likely led to an expectation in the pilots to see two lighted surfaces, runway 28 left and runway 28 right. However, they indeed saw two lighted surfaces, but they were runway 28 right and taxiway Charlie. They lined up with the right lighted surface, believing that they were approaching the right runway when indeed they were approaching the taxiway. There were ample visual clues to tell them that the surface they were approaching was not a runway, and they even probably realized deep down that something was not quite right when they radioed in to ask what the strange lights on the runway, that in reality was a taxiway, were. But confirmation bias is a strong human tendency that we all fall victim to, and so did the two pilots. Another aspect that the board analysed was why the air traffic controller hadn't noticed that the plane was approaching the taxiway. As it was nighttime and activity around the airport wound down, one of the two controllers present in the control tower decided to take a break, while the other managed all ground, tower and approach frequencies. This requires some skill and can be demanding, but is not unusual and in accordance with standard procedures. After the controller cleared Air Canada to land, his attention must have been elsewhere. After United Airlines Flight 1 called, "Where is this guy going? He's on a taxiway," the controller looked at Air Canada and reportedly thought that the aircraft's position looked odd and immediately told it to go around. At that point, the crew had already initiated said go-around.
Air Canada, go around.
In the go-around, Air Canada 759.
Due to the position of the tower in relation to the approach path, it would also have been difficult for the controller to see the exact lateral position of the aircraft. And lastly, the board noted that the two pilots had forgotten to tune the instrument landing system frequency for runway 28 right. While the approach was to be flown entirely by visual clues, it would have been standard procedure for Air Canada pilots to tune the instrument landing system for runway 28 right as a backup to see whether they were properly aligned with the runway. While the instrument landing system was not in use that night, it was still very much online and would have provided valuable clues to the pilots. In the end, this flight came within feet of disaster. I guess the case is not too well known outside of the aviation community, but had the crew of this flight reacted just a second or two later, the world would probably know it as one of, if not the worst accident in aviation history. The National Transportation Safety Board recommended that the presentation of note temps is revised to a more relevant format, and it also advised Air Canada to revise current regulations regarding pilot fatigue. I really hope that these recommendations will one day be implemented, as they truly would help the pilot community a lot. And that was the story of Air Canada 759. If you liked this video, make sure to also check out my video on Qantas 72, where a corrupted computer sent an Airbus A330 in a dive. If you like the channel, consider subscribing for weekly aviation content. See you all in the next one.